Chapter 1: The Laughing Circle. They always laughed the loudest when they saw me alone. It happened at weddings, birthdays, office dinners, any place where couples gathered, and single people were treated like unfinished projects. Someone would clap me on the shoulder and say, "So, still single?" Another would chuckle and add, "Don't worry, not everyone is meant to find someone." The laughter that followed was never kind. It was the kind that pretended to be friendly while quietly reminding me of my place. I smiled every time. I learned to. Inside, though, something chipped away a little more with each joke. I wasn't unsuccessful. I had a stable job, a quiet apartment, and dreams I kept carefully folded inside me. But in their eyes, none of that mattered. I hadn't crossed the one invisible line society seemed to worship, having someone beside me. To them, being single wasn't a phase. It was a flaw. The worst were my old classmates. At our 10-year reunion, they arrived in pairs, hands intertwined, stories polished for display. Engagement rings flashed under warm lights. Babies slept in carriers. When my turn came to speak, someone laughed and said, "Well, at least you've got freedom, right?" Another added, "Freedom in silence." They laughed again. That night I walked home alone under streetlights that flickered like tired eyes. The city felt louder without voices beside me. For the first time, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I really had fallen behind. Maybe I was invisible unless someone else stood next to me. Days passed, then months. The mocking never stopped. It only evolved. Messages arrived less often. Invitations came with pity instead of warmth. Even at work, promotions seemed to favor people with stable family lives, as if commitment at home proved competence everywhere else. I told myself to endure it, to be patient. Then came the accident. It was raining, the kind of rain that erased edges and turned headlights into blinding stars. I crossed the street, thinking about nothing, about everything, when the world suddenly tilted. Sound vanished, light shattered, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling above me wasn't white and cracked like the hospital I remembered. It was wooden, familiar, too familiar. I sat up, heart pounding, and stared at my hands, younger, unscarred. On the desk across the room lay an old phone, its cracked screen lighting up with a date notification. 10 years earlier. Panic rose, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to clarity. Memories flooded back, not just of what had happened, but of what would happen. The people who laughed, the ones who thrived, the opportunities I'd missed, the confidence I never claimed. I wasn't confused for long. If life had truly given me another beginning, I wouldn't waste it trying to fit into their expectations again. I wouldn't chase approval or swallow insults with a smile. I wouldn't measure my worth by who stood beside me. This time, I would build something they couldn't ignore. And when they laughed again, because they would, I'd let them, because I knew what was coming. And they didn't. Chapter 2: The Day I Chose Silence. The laughter didn't stop after that night. If anything, it grew louder. At work, the jokes became routine. Casual remarks slipped into conversations like harmless dust. Yet each one settled heavy in my chest. "Still single?" Someone would ask with a grin. "You should lower your standards." Another would laugh and add, "Some people are just meant to watch others move ahead." I smiled. That was the most dangerous part. After Rebirth, I had learned something vital. Reacting too early changes nothing. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could be sharper than words. Inside, though, memories stirred. I remembered how, in my previous life, I had tried desperately to prove myself, working harder, speaking louder, chasing validation that never came. I remembered attending weddings alone, pretending not to notice pitying glances. I remembered how their mockery had slowly carved doubt into me until I believed I truly was lesser. This time, I refused to repeat that mistake. I began waking earlier than everyone else, using the quiet hours before sunrise to build what no one could see. I studied markets, skills, patterns of success I had once ignored. I trained my body, not to impress, but to remind myself that discipline was power. Every drop of sweat became a promise I will not be the same man. One afternoon, my phone buzzed during lunch. A message appeared in the group chat, the same one where jokes were born. "Singles night this Friday. Don't worry, we'll bring extra chairs for you." Laughter emojis followed. I locked my phone and continued eating, my expression unchanged. Across the table, someone watched me carefully, confused by my calm. They expected irritation, embarrassment, something to feed on. I gave them nothing. That evening, I walked home instead of taking the bus. The city lights flickered on, reflecting off shop windows like parallel lives unfolding all at once. Couples walked hand in hand. Once, that sight had filled me with longing. Now it filled me with clarity. I didn't hate love. I hated dependence. Back in my small apartment, I opened my notebook, the one I had started since Rebirth. Pages were filled with plans, timelines, names. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote a single sentence. They don't see me yet, and that's exactly why this will work. Days passed. My behavior shifted subtly. I spoke less, listened more. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped attending gatherings where I was only there to be laughed at. Instead, I invested in spaces where growth was quiet and lonely, but real. People noticed, though not in the way they expected. Whispers replaced jokes. "He's changed," someone said. "Trying to act mysterious," another replied. They were wrong. I wasn't acting. I was preparing. And somewhere deep inside, I felt it. The slow, undeniable turning of fate. The same people who mocked me for being single had no idea. They were standing at the edge of their own regret. Because this time, when they finally looked at me again, I wouldn't be standing alone anymore. Chapter 3. The First Shift in Power. By the third month after his rebirth, the laughter had begun to change. At first, it was subtle. Whispers that stopped when he entered a room. Curious glances that lingered a second too long. The same people who once mocked him for being single, for being behind in life, were now confused. He hadn't announced anything. He hadn't shown off. Yet somehow everything around him felt different. In his previous life, this was the time when he'd tried desperately to fit in. He remembered the awkward dinners, the forced smiles, the way he laughed at jokes that cut him the deepest. Back then, he believed approval came from endurance. This time he chose silence. At work, he stopped volunteering for thankless tasks. He focused only on results, clean, undeniable results. When problems appeared, he solved them before anyone else noticed. When meetings dragged on with excuses, he spoke once, calm, direct, and ended them. People began listening. One afternoon during a team discussion, a colleague who used to mock him openly smirked and said, "You've been quiet lately." Finally gave up trying. The room went still. In his past life, that sentence would have burned him. This time, he met the man's eyes and replied evenly, "No, I just don't need noise to prove progress." There was no anger in his voice. No challenge, just certainty. The smirk vanished. After that day, the dynamic shifted. People started asking his opinion privately. His manager began assigning him projects that actually mattered. Not because of sympathy, but because he delivered. Outside of work, the change was even more striking. The same friends who once joked about him dying alone now invited him out with a different tone, curious, almost cautious. He declined most invitations, not out of spite, but because he finally understood something he hadn't before. Access was power. And he wasn't giving it away for free anymore. One evening, while walking home, he passed a cafe where a group of them sat laughing, faces he knew too well. For a moment, a memory flickered. Himself standing outside that same cafe years ago, scrolling through his phone, pretending he had somewhere else to be. This time he didn't slow down. He walked past without looking in, his reflection briefly catching in the glass. Calm expression, straight posture, no rush. Inside the cafe, someone noticed. "Was that him?" a voice asked. Another replied, uncertain, "Yeah, he looks different." They didn't call out. They didn't laugh. They watched him leave. Later that night, as he reviewed his plans, he realized something important. This rebirth wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about rebuilding himself so thoroughly that jealousy would come naturally. To those who once looked down on him, he didn't need to prove them wrong with words. Time would do it for him, and for the first time since waking up in the past, he allowed himself a small, private smile, because the shift had begun. And this time he was in control. The morning sunlight barely seeped through the thick curtains of the mansion, yet the grandeur of the room reflected the wealth and status that now surrounded me. After the events of the previous chapters, the whispers of jealousy had grown louder. former classmates and distant relatives, who once mocked my single, struggling life, now glanced nervously whenever I walked past. The irony was not lost on me, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. I spent the day in my private library, reviewing business documents and financial reports. It was a life I had built from scratch, one that no one could ever take away. Yet despite the success, there lingered a hollow feeling. The past haunted me, not the people who mocked me, but the life I could have had if fate had been kinder. If I had been given support instead of ridicule. The door opened quietly, and my assistant entered with a report. "Sir, there's a meeting at 3. Investors are requesting your presence," she said, her tone professional yet subtly amused, as if she already knew the spectacle my presence would create. I nodded without looking up, my mind wandering to the faces of those who had laughed at me in school. The ones who had called me pathetic and worthless now looked at me differently, even with envy. A quiet smile formed on my lips. The revenge I had promised myself was no longer about destruction. It was about showing them what they had underestimated. By evening, the city lights reflected in the windows, painting the walls in a soft orange glow. I walked through the hallways of my mansion, each step echoing softly, reminding me of my journey. Each person who had mocked me had unknowingly contributed to my determination. Their words, once painful, had been transformed into the fuel that propelled me to success. And yet in the quiet moments alone, I wondered, was this the life I had truly wanted? Or was it merely a mirror to show others their own failures? Either way, the satisfaction of seeing them realize their mistakes was undeniable. The night ended with a sense of calm, a feeling that I had finally begun to reclaim what was once stolen. Not just wealth or respect, but my own peace of mind. Tomorrow promised more challenges, more eyes watching and more opportunities to assert that I was no longer the person they had once underestimated. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the subtle tension of anticipation. Invitations from former classmates, now disguised as polite gatherings, started appearing in my mailbox. Each envelope reminded me of the years I had spent alone, dismissed and laughed at. I carefully scanned the names and smiled faintly. Some faces I hadn't seen in a decade. Others had aged poorly, while I had grown into someone no one could ignore. I chose my attire with care, a crisp navy suit that spoke of quiet power rather than ostentation. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized the man staring back. The timid boy from years ago had vanished, replaced with someone confident, calculated and aware of his worth. Arriving at the venue, I immediately felt the eyes on me. The room was buzzing with whispers and barely concealed shock. Former friends, colleagues, and schoolmates shifted nervously as I passed, exchanging glances that betrayed envy and disbelief. I greeted them with polite nods, my calm smile hiding the satisfaction boiling beneath. The highlight of the evening arrived, a toast by a former classmate who had once mocked my failures publicly. As he spoke, praising the successful lives of his peers, I waited silently for the perfect moment. When his words inadvertently referenced my name with a tone of disbelief, the room went silent. I raised my glass, and with measured calmness, reminded everyone that success is not measured by past judgments but by persistence, determination, and resilience. Whispers erupted immediately, eyes darting toward me as they realized that the boy they once mocked had become the man they had underestimated. The sense of vindication was intoxicating, yet within me a quiet reflection lingered. Revenge wasn't about humiliation. It was about proving that I had never been the failure they assumed I was. As the evening drew to a close, I left with a sense of quiet triumph, not from the envy I had sparked, but from the understanding that I had rewritten my own destiny. The journey was far from over, but each small victory reminded me that years of neglect and ridicule had only strengthened my resolve. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of my penthouse, casting long shadows across the room. A cup of coffee rested in my hand, but my mind was far from the rich aroma. Emails, messages, and notifications flooded in, some congratulatory, others tinged with disbelief or envy. The world was beginning to notice the man I had become. Yet beneath the success, there was a subtle emptiness I hadn't anticipated. Years of being ignored, ridiculed, and underestimated had left a mark deeper than I realized. The victories were sweet, But the quiet moments reminded me of the boy I once was, eager to be acknowledged, desperate for approval from those who never cared. The day held a meeting with a potential business partner, a person whose opinion carried weight in the industry. They glanced at my credentials, then at me, and finally smiled with an expression that balanced respect with mild surprise. It was another small victory, yet it felt monumental. The world was now seeing my capabilities, not the ordinary label I'd been burdened with for so long. By evening, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. Her. The one who had ignored me, laughed at my dreams, and dismissed my potential. She had changed, dressed elegantly, voice unsteady, but eyes searching. Reading her message stirred something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not desire, but curiosity. She asked to meet, to talk, to explain. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I looked out over the city skyline, letting the neon lights reflect on the glass walls of my apartment. Every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night had led to this moment. She had the audacity to return after years of neglect, expecting something. But now I held the power in my hands. I could listen, forgive, or simply walk away. Tonight, I realized that real victory wasn't revenge, it was control over my own life. And this time, the narrative would be mine to write. The following morning was unusually quiet. The city hummed beneath me, but inside my penthouse, only the soft ticking of the clock accompanied my thoughts. Today was the day I had to decide, not out of impulse, not out of anger, but with clarity. Her message from last night lingered on my phone, a request to meet, a plea for attention I once gave so freely. I remembered the way she laughed at my struggles years ago, the way she dismissed my ambitions. Yet now she appeared vulnerable, almost fragile, as if the world had finally humbled her. I prepared for the meeting with the precision of a man who had clawed his way to the top. My suit was immaculate, the cufflinks gleaming under the soft morning light. I didn't need her approval anymore, but I understood the power of choice, the control I had reclaimed over my own life. When she arrived, I noticed every detail. The careful way she adjusted her hair, the slight tremor in her hands, the effort she put into appearing composed. It was clear she expected an apology, or perhaps forgiveness. I didn't give her either immediately. I let silence fill the space between us, letting her fidget, letting her realize that the roles had reversed. I spoke calmly, measured, deliberate. You ignored me. You laughed at me. You walked away thinking it wouldn't matter. But it did every day. And yet here you are. Her eyes widened, as if the words themselves had the weight of years pressing down on her. She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand gently. Not yet. Listen first. I told her everything. My struggles, my sleepless nights, my silent battles, my eventual rise. I didn't need to embellish. The truth alone was more than enough. She listened, and with each word, I saw the subtle shift in her expression: regret, disbelief, sorrow, and maybe, just maybe, understanding. When I finished, I looked at her without anger, without malice. I offered only one final word: choice. She could apologize, she could leave, or she could accept that the person she had dismissed was now a force she could neither control nor take lightly. I left the room then, letting her sit with the weight of her decisions. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, a world that had once mocked me now serving as my stage. I realized that true victory wasn't revenge, it was independence, respect, and the reclamation of every ounce of my dignity.